Let's begin with something uncomfortable. The 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history. Not medieval, not ancient, modern. 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Tens of millions under Stalin, 45 million under Mao, 2 million in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, millions dead in the colonial famines. Entire cities firebombed into ash. Nuclear shadows burned into concrete. And here's the part that unsettles people. These were not religious wars. They were modern. They were bureaucratic. They were ideological. They were secular. No pope designed Auschwitz. No priest engineered the gulags. No monk drafted the Great Leap Forward. No bishop calculated the bombing grids. These were projects of race science, of class theory, of national interest, of progress, of history. They were industrial. Trains ran on time. Forms were stamped. Quotas were met. Food shipments were rerouted. And targets were calculated. This wasn't chaos. It was a system. Humans have always been violent. But humans have not always killed like this. The easy answer is the machines. Railroads, factories, bombers, gas chambers, nuclear weapons. Of course, it scaled, we say. We built better tools. And yes, we did. And tools matter. But tools obey. They do not decide. A train can carry wheat or it can carry deportees. The rails do not choose. A spreadsheet can optimize production or starvation. The columns remain orderly either way. Machines amplify intention. They do not originate it. If entire categories of human beings became obstacles to be removed, something prior to machinery made that imaginable. Something in perception shifted. Religious violence existed long before the 20th century. It persecuted, it executed, it burned. It could be merciless. But even at its most oppressive, it operated within a world already structured. Law was believed to precede power. Judgment was believed to exceed rulers. Reality was not invented by the state. It was interpreted. That difference matters. Because to interpret an order is not the same as constructing one. You may claim divine sanction and still commit atrocity. History shows that clearly. But you do not ordinarily claim to redesign humanity itself. You claim to defend or purify what already is. Modern ideological regimes did not defend what was given. They diagnosed defects. They proposed corrections. They envisioned a new arrangement. Nazism identified racial impurity as a biological error in the organism of the state. Marxism identified class structure as the historical pathology. Maoism identified tradition itself as contamination. Imperial liberal powers identified distant population as strategic liabilities inside a global balance. Different rhetoric, different justifications, yet the same movement beneath them. Human beings rendered into abstractions. Once rendered abstract, they become adjustable. Abstraction is not inherently evil. It is necessary for complex societies. Cities cannot run on personal acquaintance alone. Policies require generalizations, statistics prevent waste, management requires distance. But distance has consequences. When forests become timber supply, we call it resource management. When rivers become energy output, we call it infrastructure. When land becomes agricultural yield, we call it planning. Gradually, without announcement, the same logic applies elsewhere. Labor becomes workforce. Citizens become demographic pressure and communities become variables. And then, without drama, persons become categories, and category is clean, category is manageable, category does not resist. A person resists, a category complies. The ideologies of the 20th century were not irrational eruptions. They were coherent systems. They believed themselves scientific. Nazism spoke the language of biology. Marxism spoke the language of historical inevitability. Maoism spoke the language of purification through struggle. And liberal empires spoke the language of strategic necessity and economic stabilization. Each identified an obstacle to progress, each promised a resolution. Each justified elimination not as hatred but as correction. Hatred is unstable, correction is stable. Hatred feels excessive, correction feels responsible. If a race threatens the future, it must be neutralized. If a class impedes historical development, it must be removed. If a culture obstructs revolution, it must be re-educated. If a colony destabilizes the war effort, it must endure deprivation. The language remains measured. Measured language travels far. Consider famine, administered through policy. Food exists, transport exists, but priority is assigned elsewhere. Ships are rerouted, resources are allocated. The decision is not theatrical, it is procedural. No one at the desk imagines himself as cruel. He imagines himself as realistic. The spreadsheet balances, the system continues. Lives vanish inside numbers. It does not feel like violence, it feels like administration. That is the difference. Violence, once procedural, loses heat. What loses heat gains endurance. Pre-modern societies were violent, but they inhabited a world thick with reference. God, fate, sin, judgment, sacred order. However misapplied, these ideas located the human being within a structure not entirely subject to revision. A person stood before something beyond the state, beyond history, beyond economic calculus. That placement creates friction. Friction slows scale. If human being is believed to carry something irreducible, soul-defined image, eternal accountability, then elimination is not merely strategic. It is metaphysical. And metaphysical violations disturb. Modern secular systems gradually thin that density. They remove transcendence. They remove metaphysical access. They render reality horizontal. Everything becomes process. Everything becomes history. Everything becomes matter in motion. With such a frame, the human being is fully legible, fully inside the system. And what is fully inside can be modified, improved, reallocated if necessary. The 20th century did not become bloodier because humans became more vicious. It became bloodier because humans became administrable, more reducible, more available to redesign. Disconnected is perhaps the simplest word. Disconnected from transcendence, disconnected from irreducibility, disconnected from the intuition that something in a person stands outside optimization. When that intuition weakens, the threshold lowers. Elimination becomes thinkable, not in anger but in planning, not in frenzy but in policy. The future is invoked, the present is adjusted, and the adjustment spreads. Systems once set in motion do not ask whether they should continue. They ask whether they are functioning, and functioning systems scale. Religion binds. That binding can be corrupted. It can justify cruelty. It can oppress. But it resists total redesign because it insists that reality is not fully ours to engineer. Modern secular ideologies do not share that restraint. They assume that suffering is a defect in the arrangement, and defects are corrected piece by piece. The correction may be humane or it may be catastrophic, but it proceeds with confidence. Confidence is powerful. Confidence builds camps. Confidence reroutes grain. Confidence reorganizes populations, all for improvement. The difference then is not merely religion versus secularism, it is connection versus disconnection. In a connected worldview, the human being exceeds the system. In a disconnected worldview, the human being is contained by it. Containment permits revision. Revision permits elimination. And elimination, once procedural, can become fast. Not because people shout, because they do not. Because the trains run, because the forms are stamped, because the targets are calculated. Quietly, efficiently, necessarily. And that is why the modern secular atrocities do not merely kill. They reorganize, they optimize, they totalize. And they do so without believing themselves to be monstrous.